Great. Okay, well, I think we are ready to pass over to Kristen. Yes, I will just say that the project, Pericles project started in May 2018 and is due to run until 2021. And this webinar is just going to feature some of the key elements of the project and give a bit of an overview. And the webinar is titled Pericles, Understanding Coastal and Maritime Cultural Heritage, Its Meanings, Risks and Potentials, which isn't the easiest thing to say in a pressure situation, but there we go. I'll pass you over to Kristen if she's ready.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so here's our webinar. We'll get started. Hello and welcome. And I should say at the top, this is the first time I've done a webinar. So let's see. And this is probably the largest audience I've ever spoken to in my career. So that's also exciting. But there's no feedback. It's just sort of me speaking to the void, although I can see Matt right now. So that's at least nice. I get a little bit of kind of recognition. Yeah, but I wanted to first thank my colleague Matt for welcoming you into the forum and going over the logistical details. Working beside me and Matt on this effort is a wonderful team we have. It's a subgroup within Pericles who are tasked with cultivating a network across Europe on the matter of coastal and maritime cultural heritage, which is kind of why we've launched these webinars. They did so much to promote this and plan and troubleshoot, and they'll be doing more in terms of, this is just the first of a few webinars. So I just wanted to say thank you at the top of the talk. I want to thank Elena Zapardi and Sarah Knight at University of York, Irene Beguier at National Regional Park of Morbihan Bay, Gulf, Jordi Vegas Macias at Wageningen University, Lisa Souza at University of Aveiro, Laura Ferguson at Queen's University Belfast, and once again, Matthew Howells here at Aalborg University. As you can see, I'm coming to you from my home office, or more like my home desk in Aalborg, Denmark. I'm Kristen Onanian. I'm an associate professor of transitions and coastal communities at the Center for Blue Governance, which is in the Department of Planning at Aalborg University here in Denmark. I'm the project coordinator of Pericles, which is an EU-funded research project out of the Horizon 2020 program. I've worked on the project since its start in May 2018, but I became the coordinator at the end of February of this year, taking over from my predecessor, Dr. Aline Delaney, who also works in my research group. So at this point, you won't see my face anymore, and I'm going to share my slides again and start going over the talk. I hope to speak about 35 to 40 minutes and have time for questions in the end. So without further ado. So hopefully you're seeing the first slide of the presentation. So the title of my talk today is Pericles, Understanding Coastal and Maritime Cultural Heritage, Its Meanings, Risks, and Potentials. This hits at the core elements of Pericles. So I have two objectives today. The first of which is to introduce Pericles and its scope to a wider audience, fellow academics, but also it was nice to see in the poll that there are indeed some heritage practitioners or people working in the coastal and maritime trades. And hopefully this will bring some meaning to your work as well, or encourage you to engage in our other channels that we have in the project. And also present mostly today in terms of the kind of scientific approach, I'll be presenting our understanding of coastal and maritime cultural heritage and its implications. And a key thing to note here at the top is I'm going to use the acronym CMCH, which stands for Coastal and Maritime Cultural Heritage. I will be saying that a lot in this talk. but you'll be seeing the acronym on most of the slides because it's a lot to get in there text-wise. So who are we? Pericles is a consortium of 11 partners throughout Europe. And as I mentioned, we are funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 research program. As you have likely already gathered, our research centers on cultural heritage, but specifically as it relates to coastal and marine spaces and places, including myriad maritime and coastal activities. And some of you who are probably familiar with the cultural heritage kind of work, they're really the disciplines of history and archaeology have been really, have pushed the field forward and have done a lot of great work. But we are actually a group of interdisciplinary social scientists, and we have historians and archaeologists on the team, but we represent a diverse set of social science disciplines, including anthropology, economics, geography, political science, sociology, planning, and marine science. So I think kind of you'll maybe see that kind of social science perspective, or this looking at the various constructions of cultural heritage, is really where the slight difference maybe in other cultural heritage work and projects. We work in 8 case regions. We have Aveiro, the Aveiro Lagoon area in Portugal. We work in Malta and the Aegean region in Greece. We have work ongoing in Brittany in France, and the Wadden Sea in the Netherlands, sites in Scotland, Ireland, including Northern Ireland, 3 coastal places in Denmark and in Estonia. So that's our geographic scope of the work we're doing. So project aims. So you know who we are, but now kind of the question is, what are we doing? And I should maybe, as some of you are familiar with EU projects, the key is always to get a name that stands for something, but everyone just uses the acronym and it's easy to pronounce and you kind of forget what it stands for. So Pericles stands for Preserving and Sustainably Governing Cultural Heritage and Landscapes in European Coastal and Maritime Regions. And yeah, somehow that reads into Pericles, and please don't ask me how, because I cannot remember, but that's why we call ourselves Pericles. And Pericles has 4 main objectives in its kind of work plan and its scope. The first of which is understanding what constitutes coastal and maritime cultural heritage, and that I'll be focusing more on today, so I'll move on. Identifying and assessing its risks, and again, we'll be talking about that a bit more today. But what perhaps sets Pericles apart is really cultivating a participatory approach, and that's both in kind of the research and that we're doing in terms of trying to pull in elements of co-production in various case regions, working and involving stakeholders in building the networks around coastal and maritime cultural heritage amongst practitioners, managers, citizens, and you'll see some of that through some of the elements I present today. And finally, our interest is, it is an academic project or a research project, but it's also quite applied and focuses on, again, sustainably governing the use of cultural heritage. So we really focus on those enabling conditions for the sustainable use of coastal and maritime cultural heritage for host communities and visitors. And you'll see this again in various facets of the project, including the participatory risk assessment framework, our emphasis on policy advice and the policy briefs and the work we're doing there, the co-production of knowledge, which hopefully again lives on beyond the legacy of the project in the communities where we've been working, and also translating our scholarship into useful outputs for schools, tourism boards, and policymakers. So those are the 4 main objectives of the overall project. And And we have a very charismatic subject matter, as many of you who know, who work in coasts and maritime places and work with people working in those areas of the world and with those tools and such. And so while I'll be speaking today about more the theoretical framing of the project, I would like to emphasize the work researchers in the consortium are doing in their demos or demonstration cases, which we refer to as demos. We look at both tangible and intangible cultural heritage, underwater or submerged cultural heritage, the interactions and integration between natural and cultural heritage, but again, with an overarching understanding that like all cultural heritage is subject to change, externally and internally driven, with both positive and negative consequences. There are multiple demos in each of the case regions, and to just give you a sense of the different flavors, I'm going to just highlight a few here. In Malta, Jordy's been doing some work around gastrotourism, pescatourism, and has been working in the community, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Marsalox in Malta, which is one of the last remaining traditional fishing villages in Malta. It's a showcase for tourism, as it received 2.6 million visitors in 2018, which is 5 times the local population of residents. So together with the community, Pericles seeks to preserve, celebrate, and sustainably manage its maritime cultural heritage, and is usually using different tools and some tech applications to facilitate that. In Estonia, there are coastal trails, which some of you in Europe are maybe familiar with the idea of heritage trails, or kind of long walking paths along routes in Europe. And the work in Estonia, they're trying to integrate some of the 3D models of some of the underwater sites that people are passing alongside on the coast, but can't necessarily access themselves without a lot of gear. So that's a way of kind of, bringing that invisible to light. And myself, I work in Sledestad, Denmark, which has a traditional clinkercraft boat building workshop, one of the few remaining that works also, especially in terms of commercial fishing, works for the coastal fleet in Denmark and has a tie to the commercial side of boat building, not just kind of pleasure crafts. But that's been changing around the dynamics around what's happening in fisheries and its management in Denmark. And so I'm looking at how that, and also Matt's helping me quite a bit with it, about how the knowledge or the intangible heritage around this type of boat building may remain with these kind of new pressures or kind of changes in our social and economic makeup. So that's just a bit of a taste. And then my final point of kind of giving you the overview of the project is, you'll recognize the map that I showed before, and that's from our interactive mapping portal, which, the URL is right up there if you're interested. And this allows you to upload photos, videos, audio clips, and geolocate them, and help others find cultural heritage. Oh, my video is still on. Oh, well, sorry, everyone. So I don't know how to turn that off. Anyway, I'll keep going. Yeah, upload photos, videos, audio clips, and geolocate them, help others find cultural heritage that is meaningful to you, describe it, tell us why it deserves recognition, and democratizing the designation of cultural heritage in Europe. That's kind of the aim there. If you are interested, of course, check out the link. It's also accessible through the project website. And Sarah and I will be holding a webinar demonstrating the capabilities of the mapping portal. So stay tuned. Could be a great opportunity to explore and map places in your local areas, as we are all likely staying rather close to home over the summer holidays, I would suspect. So could be a great way to get out and see some places that you can, walk, drive, bike to in your local area. So now turning our attention on, again, the more kind of theoretical basis, or how we conceptualize coastal and maritime cultural heritage this was one of the, kind of building, foundations of the project and some of the first work we've done. And this is based out of a paper that we have under review, which was from one of our first outputs. And I should say at the top, we define coastal and maritime cultural heritage as a set of tangible and intangible items linked to human activities and interactions taking place within coastal and marine, geographical or cultural areas in the past, the present, and imagined futures. We're theoretically drawing from diverse literatures, one of which is the risk, resilience, and adaptation literature. We also pull from space, place, and identity, and also from deliberative governance and participatory. Do I need to stop to answer the Q&A about the portal, or are we going to do that later? I think I'll keep all questions to the end, and if there's an interest about the portal, I'll follow up. Yeah, great. So, yeah, so those are three diverse literatures, which, have maybe at times we've questioned our brilliance in outlining them, but they really have helped to build up our understanding. So first, to understand coastal and maritime cultural heritage, you need to understand what we call the constraining conditions of the sea and shore. And coastal and marine areas face several threats and risks, such as the environmental conditions of the coasts and seas, the impacts especially of climate change, expansion of coastal tourism, economic restructuring in key maritime sectors, the invisibility of what happens underwater, and the processes of demographic change, remoteness, and peripheralization. These constraining conditions affect the preservation, protection, utilization, and management of coastal and maritime cultural heritage, but also how it will be defined and conceptualized for multiple diverse and current publics and future generations. So that was a lot said there, but we really, it's both kind of the environmental setting in which, of the sea and shore, and also with anthropogenic climate change and its effects, but also just kind of some of the kind of by design, the invisibility of for instance, shipwrecks and stuff being underwater, and it being difficult to access that cultural heritage unless, you have certain dive certifications that's not necessarily accessible to everyone. And so that invisibility kind of is a bit special to this particular form of cultural heritage. But also there's the invisibility vis-a-vis peripherality. And we understand peripherality, it can both be in terms of like absolute peripherality or the more, physical geography understandings of where the coast as being the margin, but also around rural communities or certain segments of, in terms of class or ethnicities that have maybe been not included in certain discourses around cultural heritage. And so that again I think there's a lot happening there, especially in coastal areas. And then we have this kind of idea of things becoming overloved in terms of just tourists wanting to access some of these things. And if they're in more precarious positions due to climate change, or for instance, if you have a boat building workshop and people want to come through and see what's going on, but those are still working spaces, and sometimes negotiating, having visitors while also having a working space, can be a challenge. So again, as we kind of transition or find this middle ground from, landscapes of more production and productivity and primary production to landscapes of leisure, but that have perhaps always been landscapes of leisure, as people have always gone to the coast for refuge and such. So there's just a lot of interesting dynamics in this particular setting. And this all translates to particular risks and threats to coastal and maritime cultural heritage. So for us, understanding coastal and maritime cultural heritage, we've developed two concepts around the notion of communities of meaning, which is very much rooted in our work, our review around theories of space, place, and identity, and communities of which then leads into our notion about communities of participation, which is focused on deliberative and participatory governance theories. So communities of meaning, we understand, are important to understand in order to elaborate the various opportunities, but also the tensions in preserving cultural heritage and cultivating reliant enterprises as a part of wider regional development strategies. A community of meaning, we define, consists of a diversity of actors who share a concern regarding the development of sustainable practices of coastal and maritime cultural heritage, and who define and develop these practices of cultural heritage by dealing with and referring to the constraining conditions which threaten it. In this process of giving meaning to coastal and maritime cultural heritage, actors within a community of meaning define and redefine space and place, originating from and resulting in different identities and meanings of coastal and maritime cultural heritage. Policies and doctrines on coastal heritage, on cultural heritage, often remark on its intrinsic connection to identity, but this link hasn't adequately been examined. So the interwoven concepts of space, place, and identity help address conceptualizations of coastal and maritime cultural heritage and its relevance and meaning to society. So that's the gap we're trying to address. Scholarship on identity provides insight into different forms of connection people make to others, especially the contemporary insight on intersectionality or the overlay of multiple identities. A relational understanding of space and place pushes back on the universality of experience and an essentialism that can emerge from calls for quote unquote unity and helps us question the hegemonic narratives that deserve examination and critique. Furthermore, discussions within space, place, and landscape address challenges in understanding and operationalizing connection to the environment. In many respects, tangible cultural heritage has an analog in the concepts of materiality, and intangible cultural heritage relates greatly to the discussions of identity. In turn, we explore what we have termed communities of participation to explore how the degree of inclusion-exclusion of identity and place can then translate into the management of cultural heritage. So a community of participation is the governance setting of coastal and maritime cultural heritage and defines the possible involvement of actors in the conceptualization of coastal and maritime cultural heritage, and through processes of inclusion and exclusion, as I've said. The involvement of actors can range from indirect participation to forms of active and direct participation or deliberation. And a community of participation develops around a specific conceptualization of coastal and maritime cultural heritage in terms of space, place, and identity. Within communities of meaning, coastal and maritime cultural heritage is conceptualized in terms of space, place, and identity, as I've said. And in these communities, it's actively used to construct or challenge place narratives and place identities and vice versa, which is reflected in the way cultural heritage is taken up in political and policymaking processes. For example, coastal and maritime cultural heritage can be instrumental in building a meaningful sense of place and political in relation to the perception of boundaries, power relations, and democracy. Hence, coastal and maritime cultural heritage is intertwined with the social and political fabric of places and placemaking activities in ways that arguably require significant attention to aspects of knowledge sharing, participation, empowerment, and mutual social learning processes. So that was a lot and probably a bit dense. So my hope is that this will have a kind of an illustrative example from the Belfast case of this idea around inclusion and exclusion. So Belfast is the site where the Titanic was built. And there's a lot of effort around developing kind of a heritage narrative around the Titanic. But sort of in the shadows of the Titanic, you have, a much more kind of working class heritage around East Belfast shipbuilding community. And the pictures from one of our researchers, Laura Ferguson, she's taken kind of the various small memorials or small kind of heritage markings that are around that kind of shipbuilding community. And she summarizes really nicely in this slide that around East Belfast shipping communities, highlighting that the shipbuilding industry is of historical and symbolic importance to East Belfast, yet its communities are in danger of being forgotten as a result of the new narrative of what she calls the Titanic Spectacle. And they are also far removed from the affluence of the Titanic quarter's economic redevelopment. So I think which also has a nice way of illustrating that indeed narratives influence structural support, or this kind of placemaking can sometimes leave some out and have others kind of pushed out and not kind of able to access the resources, which is, one of the things I think we need to think about and challenge around a cultural heritage, or really think about this kind of greater inclusivity. So I think another example of how we operationalize our communities of meaning and communities of participation into the applied or policy-oriented space is our participatory risk assessment. Colleagues have developed a draft framework that we're using in select demos. And the framework reflects the overall normative stance taken by the Pericles Consortium partners that participation by communities of meaning is a key prerequisite to come to sustainable management, conservation, and use of coastal and maritime cultural heritage. And so we have this two-tiered or double-layered approach, and hopefully the illustration of our very nicely maritime themed cake can help you think that through. So the first layer really focuses on the scoping and ensuring participation. So getting a sense of the context, really. And then that second layer is about managing and using cultural heritage at risk. And the next slide will elaborate a little further. But I wanted to underscore the principles at play here in this participatory risk assessment framework, in that, the work is trying to isolate methods and tools that facilitate stakeholder participation throughout the assessment process. It builds on the understanding that risk assessment is a social process with recognition of its dynamism or how it changes throughout as it unfolds. And a balancing of kind of the methodological rigor, but also the social and the inclusion in risk assessment is also kind of one of the key things that those doing the work in this in Pericles are focusing on. So this is from the work from the draft risk assessment. And it's just, a simple flow chart, which is always nice because it makes things clear, but it's important to highlight 2 points: that even though it's represented as a flow chart, the assessment process is not necessarily linear, and understanding the context of coastal and maritime cultural heritage under research and the social and political dynamics is crucial for an evaluation of the current state of heritage and participation processes. Considering such processes are very important to support participation at different moments by different actors. These dynamic iterative loops are key points to consider in developing the draft framework as we move into the final framework, which thus might be a target for a wider audience, but we're still working on that. So layer 1, which is in blue, you have a self-assessment, and this can be done by either groups or individuals, kind of checking kind of what you know or what you assume and what you don't know, and trying to, and, you know, not just kind of getting, you know, taking stock, but really trying to identify bias or implicit assumptions at the start. You know, a scoping of the study, including environmental and social or human-made risks, but also the social processes and dynamics that are at play in the community. And then a diagnosis, so looking at both risks, but also the values behind cultural heritage. And this can be taken in a deductive, which a little more top-down or a little more structured approach, or can be done more inductively, building up from local context to developing those, identifying those risks and values. The idea being to combine different knowledges, define the value of cultural heritage, identify the overlaps and gaps amongst different groups of where those values lie. And then layer 2 talks about the importance of prioritization, decision, definition of means of action, adaptation and resilience, and monitoring and evaluation. And of course, again, participation is key in all of these things, all of these blocks, so to speak. So again, I'd like to kind of bring there's a nice example from one of the case demos, which is in France, and that's the climate change, coastal risks, and cultural heritage. And this case study focuses mainly on the municipality of Lac-Mariquet in Gulf of Morbihan, which is a rich maritime and coastal heritage, dikes, tidal mills, oyster farms and farmers, salt marshes, coastal fountains, coastal paths, natural areas, Neolithic remains. It's rich. It's rich with all those different kind of elements of cultural heritage, natural and cultural. And in this municipality, both University of Brest, one of our partners, and the regional park, another partner, they've done an inventory or an assessment of the maritime built heritage, and also produced maps of vulnerability to natural hazards, especially from submersion. And thus, in a participatory approach, the inhabitants have been solicited and consulted on several occasions through workshops, interviews, to gather their perception of the maritime heritage, its threats, both natural and anthropogenic, and to suggest an adaptive management mode. And in the fall, they'll continue that work in taking the plan and scoping it further and working again in a participatory process. Hopefully maybe in an in-person setting, but we will have to see. So that concludes my what I had to say kind of content-wise, but I wanted to signpost a few ways you could join us again. One of which is we have, as I mentioned, we have future webinars, one of which is with ICOMOS France, which I'll give a little bit more information on in the next slide. As I said, we have a mapping portal demonstration from Sarah, and also a nice crossover event with another EU project, Heritage, which focuses on cultural heritage, but in rural settings and as part of rural development or rural regeneration initiatives. And so we'll be doing that. As we said at the start, you know, join the Facebook group to connect with others, both in your local area, but across Europe, and trying to share experiences. Follow us, friend us, contact us, start a chat in various forms in social media. And our hope is we'll have regional workshops and continue to build up these regional networks. We'll have to see what that looks like in terms of safety. And also we're having the MARA conference in Amsterdam, which is every other year, the MARA People in the Sea conference. They hold a policy day before the conference every time. And one of the themes is on coastal and maritime cultural heritage. And that will be in the end of June, early July 2021. So mark your calendars. We'd like to really have a really exciting event of exchanging experiences, methodologies, but also not just from academics, but from practitioners, from policymakers who are interested to hear more, et cetera. And so just to be clear on the details for the next webinar, that will be on the 24th of June at 1 o'clock Central European Time. It will be presented by Isabelle Palmy, who's the director of ICOMOS France. And ICOMOS is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, as many of you know, and also Jean-Pierre Thibault, who is the Inspector General of Sustainable Development and Administration, and he's the administrator of ICOMOS France. So Isabelle will introduce ICOMOS France and what activities it's undertaking. And Jean-Pierre will give you a presentation on a definition and 5 principles for enhancement of heritage spaces. I will note that this will be, I believe, done in French. So hope if some French speakers are on today and feeling like, oh, you know, hard to keep up in English, this would be a great opportunity for you to engage, or those who like to take in science and culture in other languages. This is a great opportunity to do such. So the information's up there, and stay tuned. Irene will be facilitating that webinar. So I think that's enough from me for right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to start my video. Uh-oh, I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. So maybe one of my hosts can help me out. Yes, great. Well
I'm
done.
back.
Okay. Yeah. So do we have questions?
Yes, I think I will just take the one about the portal first. It was asked if it's possible to post heritage on the map outside the project countries, and I have received an answer from Sarah. So I'll read that one out. So the portal is currently focused on collecting data for the European case regions, but we have had a lot of interest in opening up the portal across Europe. So hopefully in the future we will be able to do so, and we will also be able to extend this beyond the life of the project. So if you would like to get involved with that, please get in touch with us, and also remember that we are having a portal webinar at some point, although we're not sure exactly when it is yet, but keep Facebook, Twitter, and we'll keep you informed about that. So that was that one. And then, so the most liked question, congratulations, is does mass tourism actually pose a threat to traditional communities, such as the Maltese fishermen, when greater portions of the community are adapting for an ever-growing tourist market?
That is a great question. One, as not doing the case research myself, I can't totally answer to it, but I can at least say that I think those themes and those types of questions, and wondering about kind of questions of coexistence, and maybe kind of thinking through tipping points of the importance of maintaining traditional activities if they are a driver or they are an attraction for tourists to come to an area. I mean, you can't just only focus your policies then in tourism or in the building of tourism if, you know, it's going to drop off because there's nothing to kind of see, or there's kind of a feeling of loss around those traditional user communities, be it seaweed harvesters, boat builders, fishermen, or fishers, etc. So it's a very good question. I don't feel confident to answer that with a yes or no, but my hope is that as we continue in working in the project, we will be wrestling with some of those more difficult questions that are raised.
Great.
That was satisfactory.
I hope so. There's quite a large range of questions and topic matter, so I'm not jealous of you. We've now got a more practical question. Was there any potential to extend to other Mediterranean countries? Is there a collaboration with the On the Frost Foundation, for example, that operates in the East Mediterranean?
Ooh, I'm not sure. I would say we have the Aegean partner who's working there. And of course, I think maybe if we're focusing on building regional networks, that could be a good way to connect and see if, you know, themes or things that are coming out of that case or those case demos would be meaningful. So yeah, we'd like to definitely connect to those kind of in the neighborhood, but we won't be expanding where we are doing research because we're in. As I might have said, we started in May 2018. We have about a year and a half more to go in the project, and so that's kind of where that stands. But maybe in future research, it would be really nice to know of what's happening.
Great. Okay, and the next question is from Jack Pink, and it is with regard to the risks and threats to CMCH. Have you looked at how this is being managed by cultural visitor organisations such as the UK's National Trust for its Shifting Shores and Playing Our Part policies?
We do have demonstration cases in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, which would both, I think, be under the purview of a UK policy. But that work's being done by Elaine and some others at University of the Highlands, and also those at Queen's Belfast. So I think hopefully we can look into that, but I don't know the specifics of that. I don't know if Elaine wants to jump in, but a good point to follow up on.
Okay, and we have from Fiona Bacchus, what participatory methods do you use to engage with locals in the case study areas? Do you include them in the project through public sessions, for example? And how do you disseminate this knowledge?
Yeah, so it depends. It's a bit local context dependent. As I highlighted in the French case, they've indeed had public meetings that there was a photo of the participants in one of the workshops. So workshops are one participatory method that also kind of key informant interviews and going out to practitioners is another way. We've also been engaging. Let me think. We have multiple things that are happening. Work with schools and also with tourism boards in terms of capacity building around, so making leaflets, flyers, developing educational materials, e-booklets, so those practitioners, and some of which is co-produced with those practitioners. The Easy Tourism app and some of the work in Malta is also engaging in terms of identifying more kind of localized cultural heritage features that could then go in and be used in this app interface that would help kind of maybe some smaller folks to get into the kind of tourism or blended kind of pescatourism economy. Let's see. In terms of we've also been we're a little challenged at the moment because we can't meet in person, or really it's much more difficult, or only a few places really can at the moment. So we have been trying to figure out how we could host meetings online amongst folks. I think they're considering doing one of those up in Scotland. And that's a little bit of what's going with the French webinar with ICOMOS that Irene has planned. Hopefully will be a little bit more interactive as well. Yeah, so that's, I think we're trying things out, we're experimenting, and we are kind of noting our own experiences for kind of reporting, which hopefully then can be used by others when they want to take on more participatory approaches in the future.
Thank you. The question ranking is changing in front of my eyes, so I'm having to keep my eye on it. So the next most liked question is, are there any tangible examples of how this project affected cultural heritage?
Not done yet. Yeah, I would say one, we're not done yet. That's a good one, but that's a high bar, I think, in some ways. I think we'll have to see in terms of the policy briefs and such that we produce, and the access to more policymakers at both local but EU levels. That's kind of the main kind of focus point. But also in the, kind of, again, building these networks that hopefully become more active and are more kind of either organized or know of each other and know of each other's activities, because I think things can get a bit siloed, or people are doing similar things but they don't know of each other. And I think that would be kind of a lasting impact of this project, is that the networks that were built that can take forward some of the recommendations. But that's where we're heading towards there. Oh, excuse me, I can tell it's like some dust.
Okay, and the next question is in French, and unfortunately my GCSE in French doesn't permit me to read this one out in French. But thankfully Irene has done a translation for us.
Okay.
Double check. So it's, how are local coastal communities different from continental communities? Jobs at sea, place of women, links with natural and marine environments.
Okay. So I should say, yeah, so maritime communities being understood of people at sea versus the inhabitants of the coasts, and how are those different?
I think so. Yeah.
That's a good question as well, that I'm not sure I know the answer to exactly. I would say you probably have, but this goes to the why it's important to think about space and place. And why it's important to have sometimes a more networked understanding of community, and especially around occupational community. So a lot of maritime, like seafarers and such, I mean, it's, their connections are more, through this networked understanding and through an occupational identity, whereas kind of a lived or coastal inhabitants in a place have maybe a more place-based, but also probably have elements of kind of occupational identities that are tied to that place. So I think there could be some kind of differences in seeing of how, but also the experience of the environment would be very, very different for maritime communities, or anyone who's, for instance, like working on a oil and gas platform in the communities around that, or again, seafarers. It's a very different understanding than those on shore. So there's, I think all these questions are just highlighting that this is an incredibly rich area of research, and that we will not be able to do it all. But hopefully, kind of, again, getting discussions started, connecting people, and flagging the importance to think about the nuances of this topic will help then inform better policy and or even better, better understandings among public of the different needs of groups and communities.
Great. And I'd just like to flag at this point that it would be great to see everyone on the Facebook group, so we can carry on these discussions with each other as well. I think it's a fantastic networking opportunity and a really good, yeah. So get involved on Facebook and Twitter if you will. Here we go. The next question is from Tim. It's a long one. You mentioned overlooked places. This reminded me of an old idea, carrying capacity. Is this a concept you've explored in the project? I think it is something to do with which is rather a challenge to calculate in reality. So is the challenge to calculate carrying capacity in reality? Have we explored this in the project?
No, I think that probably goes to maybe the overloved discussion a little bit, and probably also kind of maybe on the flip side goes to what we were talking, the first question that we had about Malta, and the balance around traditional fishing communities and emphasis towards tourism or transition towards tourism in the kind of wider place. I don't know. I mean, we haven't, carrying capacity, of course, is also a very biology, ecology-based concept that we probably haven't necessarily adopted. I didn't talk about today, we have talked about this idea about continuity versus more transformative forms of cultural heritage. And maybe that gets a little bit about to this kind of idea of tipping points, which I think is you could also sort of encapsulate in terms of a carrying capacity or a maxing out of resources. And I could certainly, in the work we're doing in Zlatosland around boat building, and I think you could think about it in terms of intangible cultural heritage, or like the tacit knowledge, or the tactile knowledge that you can't necessarily just write down and have someone be able to pick up a book and then know how to make a clinker craft boat. Like, that's not necessarily going to work. That it's much more this kind of lived, and thus has to get passed down. And if that number of people keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because the demand for those skills is not really there in a modern economy, yeah, you could get maybe like kind of sort of opposite of like extinction. And we've talked a little bit in our conceptualization again around the continuity and transformative forms of cultural heritage, that might also be about, dormant or potentially extinct cultural heritage, or that's when probably cultural heritage really becomes history. Again, interesting sort of like borderland kind of gray area, can't quite put your finger on, but I think those are the questions, if I'm really hearing from one, that's, in fairness, that's my interests usually. But I think from the questions today, it is highlighting like, the kind of fuzzy areas between the black and the white are where people are really interested, or where this field kind of is going.
I think we already have time for one or two more.
Yeah, that would
Alicia has asked, how is the information gathered from the Pericles project going to be used to inform EU policy, given that the research is interconnected across various sectors, fisheries, tourism, heritage? Which EU policies are we likely to inform?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I know the EU would like us to do a small roundtable, and we were supposed to do that in June in person, but I don't think that's not going to happen in person. I think, I mean, yeah, that's the challenge around, you have I guess a place to start would be around the blue growth strategy, and maybe if the kind of Green Deal focus moves into the blue, that's also kind of an area in which highlighting the work here and the multi-sector approach is important. But yeah, I mean, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive has some elements, but it's very much an environmental policy, and it's carried out member state by member state. Integrated coastal zone management or marine spatial planning, the marine spatial planning directives would probably be a point of influence at the EU policy level that would be relevant and important in this work. and certainly the planners who we have working on the project work in that area. Common fisheries policy, as we always kind of go back to and talk about, and how much do they really want to strengthen things like Article 17 or the flag program too. I would say definitely relates in many ways. But this is also, this is a discussion around, our European understanding of rural not only being agrarian or forest communities. I think also could be an interesting place to see if there are some ways we could influence those policies. But in the project, of the focus on the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Integrated Coastal Zone Management, and the CFP.
Great. Okay. We've got time for one more, I suppose. Will the EU funding finish in 2021, or will there be an extension due to the pandemic?
Who asked that one? Well, I don't know. I would say, so we were a little delayed even before the COVID-19. So the project was supposed to complete in May of 2021, but we will go to October 2021. We're going to have to assess how much this has impacted our, some case demos have already collected data and are probably okay. And we've been able to adapt or tweak slightly, and seeing kind of what the opening up looks like over the summer and in the fall, we'll reassess whether we need to request an extension. And but yeah, that's kind of an internal discussion. So.
Yeah. Okay. We have 2 minutes left. Would you like to say something to wrap up, or would you like to go for another question?
You had an easy question.
An easy question. There's one in French which I can't read or understand.
Okay.
Is there a link between Pericles and the UN Ocean Decade?
A little bit, could be better. There is the Ocean Decade Heritage Network that we're in connection with and have talked to a bit. I'm hoping to reach out to them, especially for Mara Policy Day. So that might be a kind of our best link or clearest bridge. Of course, if there are those of you out there who know of ways we should connect, please write us, please tell us. Yeah, I've been to some Ocean Decade events myself, but yeah, nothing too explicit at the moment.
Okay, well then I think we should say thank you very much. Yeah. There are some questions that we haven't been able to answer, but I think it's really good how many questions there are and how much engagement there has been in the chat and in the question and answer section here. So please do get involved on Facebook and Twitter and keep talking to each other and keep talking to us. And I don't know if Kristen wants to say anything for the final round.
No, I just want to say thanks. I think we had above 120 people, and I can still see 118 are still with us in the end. So that's impressive. But we didn't get like a drop off to 10. So that's nice. And I hope please comment and let us know if there could be certain improvements. But we hope you've enjoyed, and keep track of us, keep in touch. And especially if you're working in some of the regions and you want to participate in workshops or in networks, please be sure to get in touch with us. Academics, we know you'll find us anyway, so we know you already, maybe. But definitely some of the practitioners are still, but academics are good too. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Bye. Stay safe.